Good afternoon and welcome to Access Lunchtime. My name is Maria Barnes. I'm the president of Barnes Business Solutions and also of the Access Lunchtime user group. We as Access Lunchtime group cover all different aspects of Microsoft Access. We cover desktop presentations, we go over web app presentations, connections with SQL Server, all kinds of things, pieces of Microsoft Access. It's kind of a generic group. The group is triggered on people who would like to just take up to an hour out of their day while they're sitting at their desk, hopefully in a quiet area, eating their lunch and listening to some information. So that is what Access Lunchtime is about. If you're interested in a very specific type of access and presentations on that, please visit the AccessUserGroups.org website, and you will see there are also other groups besides Access Lunchtime, and some of those are area specific and others specialize in a specific area of Microsoft Access, like there's a web apps group, there's a SQL Server group, so please take a look at that. Today we are covering SQL Server Migration Assistant, and that is a tool to use to migrate Microsoft Access data into SQL Server so that you can then have SQL Server as your back end and keep Microsoft Access as your front end. The previous presentation, which should be available on our website in the videos area under Access Lunchtime, and I see one of our users is having trouble finding that video. At the moment, it's actually down at the bottom of the videos. Most of the videos are in reverse order, so that the most recent one, which I think before that was in October, is at the top. This one, I'm working at getting it moved up to the top, but right now it's at the very bottom of the list, and that was last month's January presentation, and that was on integrating Access and SQL Server, or migrating Access to SQL Server. That talked a little bit about SQL Server Migration Assistant and is a great preview for this presentation. So if you are listening to a recording of this today, I would highly encourage you to go listen to that presentation first and then take a look at this one. It'll make just a little bit more sense. Today we are going to cover version 7.2 of SQL Server Migration Assistant, a little bit about the operation of it, what it looks like. We're going to go through some of the settings, the overall settings on it, and how to reuse a project. We're going to talk about data types and how Access data types translate or map to SQL Server data types. There are some general conversion rules, that are that the Migration Assistant itself has in place and that you can modify, which we'll show you how to do, and some information about why you might want to modify those rules and other things to look for, unsupported types, that kind of thing. We're going to go through the Access linked table manager and SQL Server clients, how to get to that through the table manager, how to refresh your links on your linked tables, and also a little bit of code on how to use DSN-less connection strings as opposed to using things like file DSNs all the time. We're going to work on or speak about moving your queries to SQL Server, how you do that, what are the concerns, and then how to make a query a pass-through query and not a local access query. And then if we have time, I'm going to go through a page on making SQL Server more secure. I actually had that on last month's presentation, but we really ran out of time and did not get to that, so I hope to cover that today. So first of all, SQL Server Migration Assistant. Let's look at how you get that. So you just want to Google SQL Server Migration Assistant for Access. There are a couple different versions. You'll see right away here we got version 6.0, but look at the date on that. That's 2014. That's actually the version that I demoed last month because I didn't realize that there was a newer version. That was a January presentation, and here it just came out in January. There's a newer version, 7.3, I believe it is. And that is what I'm going to demo today. Let's see if this one has a link to it, or you can just this one does not. Let me try Googling. Notice this has for access in it. And the reason it has that is there are actually, I think, about 4 different SQL Server migration assistants, and some of them help you, like you can see here, to MySQL, DB2, those kind of things. So here's the one for Access, and notice it was just released, like in very recently. So you can go to this and download it and install it. And just a word of warning, it will, when it installs, put what it thinks is best for your computer and your setup. But I found that it's not always the best and this is how you will tell. This is the one that I have on it right now. And then we have multiple versions here. If you look at Microsoft SQL Server Migration Assistant, so this one is just the plain one, and then this one says a 32-bit. 32-bit is actually what is working on my computer. So let me show you what happens to show you do not have the right version. It doesn't just not open or anything or give you this nice error message. It's just a little bit obscure that it's really not working. So the default when it opens up is the wizard, and if you want to change that default, you can uncheck this box. But the wizard takes you through the different steps in converting an Access database to a SQL Server database or migrating it to SQL Server. You've got the name, location, etc., etc. And this is the name of like the saved project if you want to save the project. So then you go in and you add an Access database. And I'm going to, I'm not going to actually do this. I'll just choose one of these. All right, and notice here it has Access, it has databases, the particular database, and then it's got queries or tables. You can check both or you can check one. But when you look at this, it does not have actually any tables. And I think if you check this, oh, here, look at this error here. Hover just right over that. An error message that comes up. Oh, boop. Let's show that. All right, well, in any case, the error says if you can get it to show, it says something about communication problems. If you see something like that, or if you don't see the tables listed, you probably just have the wrong version. So you can see then if I go into the other version that that does not happen. And I'm doing exactly the same thing here, just to demo that I have the right version installed here. Okay, now this time when I look, in a second here. ooh, lo and behold, we have tables. In fact, when you see tables, you can actually get more things about the table, etc., etc., etc. So that means you have the right version. Okay? So I'm actually going to close this project. I'm not going to save it, just so that I can first show you some of the things here about the Migration Assistant in general. So the Migration Assistant has several settings that you can set up to change the way it works. We have some global settings. We have some project settings, and those project settings target a specific version of SQL. And then once you get into the actual migration, you can further change the settings at the project level. But this level here is the default project level. So if you started a project and it became a specific version, or we're choosing a specific version, then that would be what it would start with as a default for your specific project, and then you could change that further if you wanted to. But if you're going to be doing the same thing every time, then you don't want to go in and do change a setting or 3 settings or whatever every time. So then you would go into the default project settings and set them first, so that your SQL Server Migration Assistant, or SSMA as we call it for short, is set up like you want to. So let's take a look at the different settings. Those are under Tools, and the global settings are here. And we have several different types. These are all GUI or user interface settings. There's output window settings, editor, dialogues, and then there's some logging settings. Now, I haven't changed any of those for my purposes, but you could. They are there, and this is a whole application setting in the global settings area. And then we have the default project settings. And again, these are all for a specific version, so you're going to target a version. Like this one is targeting SQL Server 2014 because that is what I am using for most of my purposes. So you could change to a different version if you would like, if you've got maybe one or more versions that you are going to connect with. Let me also say something about what appears here in the different targets. This is, again, SSMA 7.3, which is the newest. And you notice that it supports SQL Server 2008 through SQL Server 2016, also SQL Azure. And then we have these 2 SQL Server vNext in there, both for Windows and Linux. I have to be just honest with you, I don't really know what those are. They're a type of SQL Server that is in preview mode at this point, but SSMA 7.3 does support them, or the preview version of them. I know that the 6.0 version, which is the previous version, also supports Azure. I'm not sure about 2016. I think it only went through 2014. But basically, if you are working on an older version of SQL Server, still something prior to 2008, you might want to instead use 6.0 or even 5. I think it's 2 or 3, which is the version before that. But if you're working in one of these versions, then I would recommend that you work with the latest and greatest, which is 7.3. And again, there's different types of settings. There's some general settings, some settings regarding loading objects, regarding the user interface, and one of the important ones is the type mapping. I have several suggestions on things that you might want to consider as far as changing the type mapping, and I did list that here. We talked about the default project. Take a look at the the string conversions, the text conversions. The default in SSMA is nvarchar, and if you're not familiar with SQL, there are two types of string types. One is nvarchar, and one is without the n, just varchar, or varchar, I guess, is the more correct way to say it. The varchar uses 1 byte per length. So if you have a varchar 25, you get 25 bytes. The nvarchar uses 2 bytes per length. So if you have an nvarchar of 25, you're actually using 50 bytes. So the difference between that is with varchar, you get or are limited to the basic 256 character set that you and I probably know better as the ASCII2 table. You cannot use Unicode data, which are extended character sets. So if you are working with a database that maybe uses some overseas items or some scientific items or whatever that require that wider character set, then you do want to use nvarchar. And otherwise, you may want to save half the space and just go with varchar. So that's one place to consider changing. So like here in the memo and in the, this is memo for Access 97, notice how that's different. And the text fields, you may want to consider changing your default, and you just use the edit, and then you change the target type to varchar the length, if you want to do that. And keep in mind that the settings that you're talking about here are the default project settings. So you can go in and you can create a new migration, and you can change the mapping on one table, on one field. You can drill down and change for specific projects or specific tables in your mapping. But this allows you a way, if this is your common practice, instead of having to do this for every project, you might do it just for the target version, and then you don't have to do it or remember to do it every time. So it's some real power here, to set up it like you want to. Some other things you might want to do, the default date time is date time 2 in SQL Server, at least in some of the later versions of the assistant. So you want to check that. And again, I don't remember which version of SQL Server started with that. I think it might be 2012 with date time 2. So if you were looking, for example, I'm going to go ahead and apply this so I save my change. Let's just see here. If you were looking at 2008 and you were looking at the type mapping, nope, it does have 2 as well. But I would guess then that versions before 2008 did not have date time 2 yet. That's a relatively new type of date. But if you look at date time 2 objects directly from Access, it can sometimes not be supported. So it might be a good idea to change that to date time as an interface. And then the other one to consider, and there's different philosophies about this, is the Boolean. And basically the problem is that with Access, some people like the tiny int instead. With Access, when you do a Boolean, you're talking about yes or no, and inside the values are actually 0 for no and -1 for yes. And in SQL Server, the values are 0 for false and 1 for true. Now, in most instances, if you're going through like a linked table, Access does that conversion for you, and it transfers the -1 to 1 and back. But in some types of applications, if you're using other types of interfaces with SQL Server, maybe stored procedures and record sets or something like that to draw your data, you might have some problems if you have logic in your Access database that is looking for a -1 and or saving something using a SQL stored procedure, for example, that's going to save things as a true or yes as a 1 instead of a -1, which is what Access wants. So, and there's also the issue of whether or not something is nullable or not. So in SQL Server, unless you specifically say that that field is non-nullable, you can actually have a Boolean that has a null value. It's not 0, it's not 1 or -1, but it is null. And so in that case, you want to make sure that, and there's no way to do that default here, but I'll show you the table, when it gets set up, and you probably want to make sure that your default is set, that it's not allowed to be nullable, and your default is probably 0 is usually what most people do. Depending upon your table or field, it might be 1 in some cases, but usually it's 0. So that's one thing with the settings that you can do. Something else you can do is you can save the project that you're working on, and then you can go and you can retrieve a project. The projects are stored by default in your documents in an SSMA projects directory, and then you can go to them. I've got a couple in here. I'm going to go to this version here. So you can select a project and open it. No, I don't want to save changes to the one I was just creating. So this opens it, and then you have the same kinds of abilities with this that you do when you get the assistant. The assistant is, or the wizard rather, it just steps you through choosing everything, but you can do the exact same things that the assistant does by these items here. The first step of it is add databases or find them, connect to the SQL Server, and then do your load or whatever. It won't, I think, enable those until you actually select your items, and then you see that converter load is enabled at that point. So you could rerun this saved migration if you wanted to. Notice that the UI here, we've got the access bit up here. There's really a lot you can see about this. If you go down to the table level, for example, you even get a data tab where you can see what your data is in Access. You get the bottom section, which is your SQL, and you can see the same kind of thing where you have, your data. This has to refresh the connection here, but where you've got your data and how it looks in SQL. Settings is one tab that, this is where I have a Boolean. This show welcome is a Boolean. Notice that it says 1 here. It's stored as a 1. And you can see things without going into like SQL Server Management Studio right here in the UI about the, what's going on and what's set up. Here's the table. This would be, your data types, and here you see the default 0, whether it's nullable or not. Now, nullable, if it's checked, means it's okay to have a null value there. So what you want in your bits that represent yes or no is it not to be checked. That's the good thing. So you see both of these here, and then the other thing to talk about is, why might you want to save a project and run it multiple times? Well, let's talk about this scenario. You're a developer. you develop a project, or maybe you have one that's already developed, you made it in Access. Now your client wants to move to SQL Server, so you use the migration assistant to move to SQL Server. You test out your development. You might have to make a few tweaks to your Access project. You want to make sure you test everything and that it still works with data in SQL, that you don't have a problem with, a data type. We need to add something extra because of it, or perhaps with the way that you access the data, if you're not using straight forms with linked tables, and you're doing something in code to a record set or something like that, you might have to adjust it slightly because it's in SQL. So you do your development, and then you're satisfied with it, and so you want your user to test it, give their okay before we put it in production. So now you want to run your migration again, and this time you want to take your migration and you want to pull it up here, and you want to reconnect to SQL Server, but instead of your test area, you want to go to the client server. So you want to, they've got a SQL server set up someplace, and you want to log on to their server, set up the new database on their server. You give them the revised front end with the linked tables to their server, and you let them test. So that's the second use of the same project. You don't have to do everything over again. The only thing you have to change in that case is the actual connection. And then you do the migration again, and it creates a database on their server instead of yours. And then they spend a few weeks or whatever it takes them. You make a few adjustments that they find in the front end, and they're ready for production. And so, maybe when you did this the second time or for testing, they wanted their production data. So you went and instead of linking to the test database that you were using, you went in here and you found a copy of their, recent copy of their production database. But it's been 2 or 3 weeks since they did that. Well, you want to go and you want to run the same migration again, and this time you want to do it with a fresh copy of their data that's today's data. Obviously when you do that, you want to have them down. You don't want to have people adding things into their Access database as you actually move it to SQL, but you don't need to have them down for 3 weeks. You just need to run the migration assistant again. It loads things up again. If the tables and the database are already there, it does not create them, but it can refresh the data for you. So that's a huge tool and a lot of power in a migration assistant. All right, so let's talk a little bit about types and what you would typically see. And on the left side here, I have Access types, and then on the right side, SQL Server types. And these are the defaults. So we saw how you can change, like nvarchar to varchar, if you don't want to use Unicode sets, if you don't have the need of them and you want to save space. The number sections or the number types are in this section here, and notice that they are, what Microsoft Access considers an integer, SQL Server considers a small int, and that's because of the precision contained in that 2-byte field, and the maximum Microsoft Access calls a long integer, the same thing that SQL calls an int. So some people don't realize that. You have to kind of be careful if you're talking about a SQL int field in Access. If you've got like a temporary variable or something, you've got to do a dim as long. You can't use int, or if you get something that's greater than that, it's like 36,000 something, then you will get an override in Access. So here are the defaults that you might be typical, and again, you can change them. Notice the replication ID, or what we call a GUID. There's a unique identifier in SQL Server. That's the name of that. Date time. There's also other ones, like we said here, date time 2. Although I don't recommend that. Currency goes to money. Auto number. Take a look at that. So auto number, there's no such thing as auto number itself in SQL Server, but if you notice in here, instead of, go back to the Access side, so here, oh, this looks like a type long. I was thinking that was an auto number. Let me just double check. This is, if you weren't here last time or haven't watched last time, what happens when you do a migration on an Access database is the SQL Server Migration Assistant renames your local tables. It puts SSMA $ in front of it, and then $local at the end. And then it uploads those to SQL Server and creates linked tables named the same as what your tables used to be. But if you need to go back and look at the data or the design of your old ones, then it has them here. And yeah, this is an auto number here, or was an auto number. So if you were looking at a database that was not yet migrated, this one's migrated. Let me look at one. I think there's one here that, oops, I've got my backup copy that I didn't migrate yet. That's nice. Nope, this one's migrated. Anyway, if you had something that wasn't migrated, you would likely see in here auto number for this. Because SQL doesn't have an auto number value, it ends up going to int, but it also then has, and I guess you can't really see that very well here. Let me pull up SSMA. I mean SQL Server. Nope, that's not what I want. Wrong one. SQL Server Management Studio is what I'm talking about. SSMS, sorry. I'm going to hook to that same database using SQL Server Management Studio. And the context copy that we did, if you take a look at that, here you see the primary key. If you go into Design View and you look at the ID, it is an integer, and then down here in the identity specification, this is what in SQL Server it's called identity, and that is like our auto number. It's got a seed and an increment to it, and you can turn it on or turn it off. It's not the same as the key. This is the primary key is often the auto number, but primary keys cannot be auto numbers. They can be something else. But that from SQL Server, that's what they look like. Okay, so no auto number directly, but instead it becomes an int, and then you set the identity value on it. So those are the different types. And then, let's see, I want to mention just a couple other things about data types. There are a couple that are by itself incompatible. Replication ID, generally recommend that you remove those and then add back unique identifiers or replication in SQL. You don't want to convert a Access database that you have replication set for into SQL directly. The attachment field, there is no direct migration for that. So you'll see if you do something with an attachment field, let's see. Those were attachments, and again, I think I may be going back where I've got something already done. Let's try, I'm going to try to close this down and do a new one here to one of my backups. Okay, I'm going to look at the copy here of time and billing. You'll notice here that says that in SQL Server, the time and billing copy does not exist. Do you want to create it? Yep, I'm going to in this case. I'm going to create a brand new database. If it was already there, then it would try to match the tables and that kind of thing. I'm not going to link tables in this instance because it's back end. I think I've got an attachment type in here. I'll show you what happens. If you don't, you should really look at things ahead of time, you know. Okay, this just tells you that, you know, we don't have those yet, new ones. Look, we've got 3 errors in our conversion, and then those errors will show up down here in the error list when we're done here. Okay, I'm going to look at my error list, and you can turn some of this stuff off so you can see more of it. So look, we got a data type is not supported. Attachment data type is not supported. And then if you look up here, you can see the little X's. That means that things weren't totally okay. And you can tell right here which tables were not okay. And if you do, thinking that it showed, there we go. I guess you have to click on the item here. Look, here's the one, the attachment. So that did not come over. So if you look at your thing here, attachments just got a varchar type that best it could do. And so it's not really bringing in your attachment in that case. I think if I remember correctly, what happens is it brings in, oh, I have no data in this, but if I believe, if we look at one of the ones I did last time, had some data in there. And for the attachment, it just brought in like nothing, a null string instead of what was in the attachment, which was an image that was attached to something for the customer. Anyway, so attachments are not supported. Multi-value fields in Access are not supported. So you really should be looking for these items before you do your migration and adjusting your Access database before you migrate for those. If you don't do that, then you see during your migration that there are problems, and if there are errors, then you really probably want to go back to Access, fix it in there, and then run your migration again so you don't get errors. Also, date and time data you should take a look at. The date time to types in SQL are not supported directly from Access, so that's why I recommend that you change the interface to create date time types. Also, you should know that date time values are stored differently in SQL. So if you happen to have code in Access that treats dates as numbers, then you need to probably adjust that, because that will no longer work. You probably are most familiar with seeing that in Excel, where you go in and have something formatted. You've got a date, and all of a sudden you don't have it formatted as a date. It shows up as some number, which is like so many days after some date in the past, which I don't remember what that is, but you can Google it if you're curious. So something else about dates, and this has bitten me before in my applications, SQL Server supports dates that start with 1/1/1753, and Access supports dates starting with 1/1/100. Now, if we're talking about stuff you're doing in modern times and not a historical database that's, way long before 1753, this might not make any difference to you. But I've had it bite me in the verification or validation step that I use. For example, if I've got an entry form or a search form where I'm wanting to then pass that date to a SQL Server stored procedure, say, and I want to search on dates from here to there, I like to validate those dates and make sure they're really dates before I pass them to SQL Server, because otherwise you get a SQL Server error. So I'd rather pop up to the user a nice message like, sorry, sir, this is not a date. But where I used to use isDate to filter that out when I was running an Access query, I have people typing in, 1/1/1200 by mistake instead of 2012. And Access isDate thinks that's just fine. But if you pass that to SQL Server, it will throw an error because it's before 1753. So you just need to be aware of some of these differences and look for those and adjust them as needed. And then Booleans. We talked a little bit about that before, but here's the issues listed out. In Access, they're stored as 0 or -1. In SQL, they're stored as 0 or 1. And if you allow them to be nullable, null is not the same thing as 0 in SQL. So you need to be aware of those. If you use link tables as opposed to stored procedures, then you do get some protection against that because Access does the conversion for you. But if you don't, and you use things in your Access code that think that we're talking about a -1 and you've really pulled a 1, it may not work. So you need to be aware of that. Let's see other things that we want to do. Before we get into queries here, I'm starting to run low on time here. Let's talk a little bit about the link table manager and SQL Server clients and refreshing links or table names with code using DSN-less connection strings. So when you are in Access and you have linked tables that are already linked to SQL Server, and you will be able to tell that these, with a little world that's an ODBC connection, if you are familiar with applications that are linked to let's see, I think this one has it. It's linked to, so this is linked to an Access project. So it still looks like an Access table, but it has a little pointer beside it. And then if you have an ODBC connection to something, it looks like a little world. So when SSMA does this, the default for it is to use the native clients, or not the native client, the Windows SQL client. So here we've got, I've changed that to the native client. If you hover over, you can see the connection string on it. So if you want to change the client that you're using, if you've already got an ODBC type connection, you can use your external data and your link table manager to change that. You can select them and you can, oops, prompt for new location, sorry. And then you can go and create like a file DSN or something like that with a different type connection. If you're going to be adding directly and adding brand new tables or a new, you don't already have an ODBC connected tables. If you were, say, in this project and you've got Access connected tables and instead you want ODBC connected to your new SQL Server project, then you cannot use the link table manager, because when you do that, it's going to prompt you for an Access database. It doesn't give you the chance to do ODBC. So in this case, if you wanted to switch to ODBC, you actually have to delete these links, and then you go in and you choose the ODBC database, and then you link to the tables like you were doing a brand new link to those tables. So I did want to go over that just a little bit because it's confusing. The interface is a little bit different depending upon what you're already doing. So from from code, you can do a lot of powerful things. You can refresh your links, and you can use something similar to this to rename your links as well. If you create brand new ODBC links, those, instead of being named with just the table names, they will actually have a schema name in front of them, like DBO is the default schema in SQL Server. If you're making a brand new application and linking to SQL Server, especially if you're using different schemas, you may want to go ahead and leave that in there. But if you're migrating an existing application that all over the place has table contacts in it, then you want to rename what it creates for you, and you don't want it to be DBO contacts. You want it to be just contacts. So you could use something similar to this and actually rename the table defs and you know, do like a replace on DBO with nothing, and do a rename as well. But this allows you to relink. This uses the DAO object with your current DB, which is the Access project. It goes and looks at everything that Access has defined as tables, and this maximize this a little so that you can see it. This here filters out the tables that you don't want. So if it only goes inside this loop if it's an ODBC connection, and it also filters on or filters out things that start with this little I don't know what that sign is called, tilde or something like that, and anything that starts with MSys, because those are system tables or temporary tables. And it goes in here and basically builds the SQL connection string for you, and then changes the connect object, or the connect property on that table definition to be the connection string that you built. And I put a couple different things in here commented out. So the one I'm using is the SQL Server Native Client 11.0. There's also a 12.0. If you're the default that SSMA brings in is the Windows version. That in the past used to be kind of error prone. It's getting much better. And then we also have the ODBC driver. 11 is what I've got on my machine. There's also a 13 now that you can use for 2016, SQL Server 2016, or for Azure. So there's different options for that. And 11 in more recent history has been the most reliable, 11 or 12, the native driver. It is supposed to be being deprecated, but if you use this one, I believe, the ODBC, you can't use DAO, I believe, with it. If that's what you prefer to use, you don't want to go with that. You need to go back to native. Then you have your server name. If you are using Windows security, you would use the trusted connection equals yes, and then you would not need to specify user ID or password. And then you have the database that you have. So this function I have created, and the one thing that you need to do is that whatever you're going to do before you open any form that has a table that you're going to be using, you need to run that routine to connect it up properly to your connection that you want. And so in this particular application, which is just an application that I got off of the Microsoft templates, and I modified slightly, to do different demonstrations. The first thing I do in the AutoExec is reset connection. And I do that before I open any forms, because like the forms, they have references to these tables. So you want to refresh your connections before, or reset your connections before you do anything else, in your program at all. And when I create things, I typically don't use AutoExec. I typically would use like a splash screen or something like that instead. But whatever you want to use. All right, we're getting really close on time here. I do want to go over briefly the queries. When you do a migration here, you can pull in queries as well by checking the queries. But notice on these two, this has syntax that is not SQL related, or it's not allowed in SQL. So IIF is an access function. It's not a SQL function. SQL's function would be probably a case or something like that instead of IIF. Depending upon what you were doing, you might use a coalesce, which is more like an NZ function in Access. But in any case, if you were wanting to put these two queries into SQL, you can't do them straight. So you would probably take this and you would copy it and you would pull it into SQL Server Management Studio and you would figure out the correct syntax. This one's a simple one. It's just got a filter on it. So that one did port over correctly. It is in SQL. I can show you here. Oh, we've got the view right here. So you can run it here, and it filters on it and only finds the presidents. So one thing you need to realize is that when you are using SQL data in Microsoft Access, and you do something like a query, if you were to run this query from Access, this is the old query, which looks like this, and you were to run this from Access, what this will actually do is pull back all of the rows of the contacts database into Access, into memory, and then apply this filter. Well, it's not a great big deal because here I've only got like 6 people in my contacts list. But if you've got 1 million rows, to pull that over from SQL is going to take a long time. So instead what you want to do is do a Pasture query. This Pasture query is actually going to SQL, and it uses the power of SQL. It runs this inside of SQL, and then it pulls back only those rows which match. So, you know, if you had 1 million rows and you had, 300 that were presidents, you would only pull over 300 rows instead of 1 million and then have Access do the work. So it can be a huge, huge speed saver to have a Pasture query. And to do that is not difficult. These are the steps here. So you go into Access, and I'll just demo it here. I can do that as you can see this. So you go in and you create query, and can't see it here because I don't have it. But instead of selecting a table, you just close it out here. And then you want to select pass-through, which is up here. And then if property sheet is not already showing for you, you want to click on property sheet so it does. And then you go over here to the connection, and you can actually go in and select this build button and choose a DSN-less connection, or you can copy your connection string, which you already know, or maybe which you go in and you do something like this and start to run. And just copy it in and paste it into your string here like that. And then you type in your query. And you don't have to do the where in this case because that's already in there. You just need to do the name of the query in SQL like that. And that's all there is to it. And then that becomes a Pasture query like this one here. So that's it. I am going to go ahead and put this other screen up here so you can at least see the SQL security considerations briefly on this presentation as well. There's lots of ways to make SQL Server even more secure than it is out of the box. and these are some of the ways to do it. And you can get very granular with security in SQL Server down to table level. You can do encryption. That's not even mentioned here. There's a lot of power. And then here are a couple resources. This link here is about understanding data type conversions, and this one's about some port numbers that are related to this bit here, SQL security considerations. So I will take just a minute. I know we're very close to the end of our time here, but I'm going to go ahead and unmute people, and if you have specific questions, you can ask them. Let's see, how do I do that? Let's unmute them, if I can do that. That didn't work. Maybe you have yourselves muted. Sorry. So if anyone has any questions, please post on the conversation or unmute yourself and ask. Okay. If not, thank you so much for joining us. Next month, I'm just going to have a little plug here. We're going to have a Q&A session, so bring your suggestions to next month's meeting, any questions you have, and we'll just do kind of a free-for-all. If you want to send me the questions ahead of time, you're more than welcome to. There's a link on Access Lunchtime about topic suggestions, but you don't have to. We can do just stuff on the fly during next month's meeting. Thank you very much for joining us.